Let us look at this map, which is now on your screens. Yesterday, Mr. Ohi made much of this map for the point that the locations where mines have exploded were not confined to the line of contact. This may be taken as true in the current phase of the proceedings, but it does not prove in and of itself that Azerbaijan's claims are capable of falling under the CERD for the reason I will explain shortly. The next slides will show to the court the progression of Azerbaijani forces during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War and the consequent retreat of the Armenian forces. The first slide shows the situation that prevailed on 27 September 2020, just before the outbreak of the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. The area shaded in red represents the areas under Nagorno-Karabakh's control. Then, on 10 October 2020, you can start seeing in blue the advancement of Azerbaijani forces into the territory. Finally, at the end of the war, a month later, on 10 November 2020, you can see most of the area now in blue and under Azerbaijan's control. Now, let us compare the map on your screens to the one Mr. Ohi showed you yesterday. I kindly ask the court to focus its attention on the bottom half of the map, depicting locations where mines have reportedly exploded away from the line of contact. As you can see, they match very closely the areas that were progressively falling under Azerbaijan's control, as our ethnic Armenian defense lines were collapsing and Armenian forces were retreating in haste. Armenian forces retreated across the very area where you can see the red dots depicting minefields. Those minefields would have protected the armed forces retreating from the advancing army. Now, let us focus on the red dots depicting minefields on the top half of the map. The next slide shows the situation prevailing on the ground just before Azerbaijan's most recent aggression on Nagorno-Karabakh as of 19 September 2023. Again, the area shaded in red is the one remaining under Nagorno-Karabakh's control, and the one shaded in blue is the one which fell under Azerbaijan's control pursuant to the trilateral statement. I should pause here to note that the trilateral statement did not diffuse the military situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, as there were repeated violations of the ceasefire, notwithstanding the presence of the Russian peacekeeping forces. The next slide shows the situation prevailing after 20 September 2023, with the entire Nagorno-Karabakh region now under Azerbaijan's control. Now, let us compare the map on the eve of last September's attack with the one Mr. Ohi showed you yesterday. As you can see on your screens now, the red areas to which ethnic Armenians retreated pursuant to the trilateral statement also very closely match the remaining red dots on Azerbaijan's updated map. And what of the remaining sporadic dots to the left side of the map? These are remnants of the first Nagorno-Karabakh war per Azerbaijan's own evidence, which I list in footnote. Mr. President, members of the court, I need not belabor a point which should be obvious to everyone in this room. This comparison, based on Azerbaijan's own evidence and objective facts, should be sufficient to show that any landmines, new or old, were placed there for defensive purposes only, including during the retreat of military forces. Landmines planted to obstruct the progress of the enemy and protect the retreat of armed forces cannot possibly amount to racial discrimination. Mr. Ohi cited to a number of other documents which on their face similarly do not establish the court's jurisdiction ratione materia over Azerbaijan's claim. Annexes 32 and 36 to Azerbaijan's first request for provisional measures were thoroughly addressed by Professor Murphy at the first hearing on provisional measures, and the relevant references are included in footnote. The court examined this evidence in its order on Azerbaijan's first request, holding that it failed to indicate that Armenia's alleged conduct constituted racial discrimination. You were also shown some photos from Azerbaijan's Annex 10 and heard some references to Azerbaijan's Annex 24, this time to the second request for provisional measures regarding booby traps. Those too were thoroughly addressed by Professor Murphy at the second hearing on provisional measures, and the relevant references are included in footnote. The court examined the evidence already when reaffirming its conclusion that Azerbaijan's allegations relating to booby traps were as implausible as those relating to landmines. You also heard a reference to a December 2020 UN Interagency Mine Action Assessment in a letter Azerbaijan sent to the United Nations Secretary General. It is quite telling that the best quote from that assessment Azerbaijan was able to master in its letter refers to indications that some houses might have been booby-trapped. And here is the important part, as the Armenians withdrew. It is pure despair to bring this forward as important evidence, and yet this is what Azerbaijan did yesterday. What remains? A report issued by an international organization of which Armenia is not a member and prepared solely on the basis of Azerbaijan's allegations, and two statements by Azerbaijan's Mine Action Agency issued after the scheduling of this hearing. None of these documents add anything to the evidence that the court has already thoroughly examined twice, nor does it detract from the reality of the situation, which is that landmines and booby traps were planted for defensive purposes, including during the withdrawal of armed forces. I now turn to Mr. Ohi's second point, that Armenia's, I quote, continued refusal to share complete and accurate information on the location of the minefields and booby traps long after the cessation of hostilities can have had no defensive purpose. For the sake of argument, I will again accept that Armenia has withheld information on the location of landmines and booby traps. For the avoidance of any doubt, however, Armenia strongly rejects any such allegation. I will, however, venture to answer Mr. Ohi's question yesterday as to, I quote, what possible justification would there be for Armenia not to hand over comprehensive and accurate information as to the placement of landmines and booby traps after November 2020? Well, there are many possible justifications, and none of them is because Armenia allegedly racially discriminated against Azerbaijanis. One justification may be, for example, that information was not simply at Armenia's disposal, and it became available only after Armenia received the forcibly displaced from Nagorno-Karabakh. In fact, the document Mr. Ohi relied on yesterday shows precisely that, when noting that, I quote, the transferred maps were received through Nagorno-Karabakh military personnel. Or maybe the answer to Mr. Ohi's rhetorical question is even simpler than that. Tens of thousands of ethnic Armenians still lived in Nagorno-Karabakh after the conclusion of the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. Maybe the landmines were used precisely for the reason they are intended to be used the world over, as a means to defend military positions. Maybe handing over maps would have compromised the security of the ethnic Armenian population. And the constant deadly violations of the ceasefire Azerbaijan purported to agree to under the trilateral statement, as well as the events of last September, prove that any such concern would have been well-founded. In short, Mr. President and members of the Court, the evidence before the Court on its face does not show that Armenia has laid mines and booby traps or withheld maps for any purpose or effect relating to racial discrimination, let alone as a part of a 30-year-long campaign of ethnic cleansing. As such, Azerbaijan has not shown good reason why the court should treat its claims any different than it did in its two requests for provisional measures.